Greetings to all of you. This is Yosefville, and we're going to take a look today at the pattern that is in the book of Hebrews. Now, this is an exciting pattern because it helps demonstrate a couple of different things. One of the things it helps prove is the divine inspiration of the book of Hebrews. It also helps to prove the fact that the Hebrew manuscript of it that we have is the original that the Greek was translated from. There's several reasons for that. I'm going to show you that in just a moment. However, let me talk a little bit about this pattern. Now, there is a pattern in the book of Hebrews whereby it cycles through 6 different themes. That is, the writer in the book of Hebrews at any given moment is on, whatever topic he's on, is one of the 6 themes that can be built from these 6 themes, or one of the themes that can be built from these 6 themes, and he just cycles through them. In fact, at the paragraph level, and this pattern exists at more than one level. There is sort of a paragraph level that it exists at, where everything in a paragraph is talking about the same theme, but you can also drill down onto sub-thoughts within that paragraph where it's cycling through this as well. But just to give you an example of how this works, the first 3 verses of the book of Hebrews are dealing with theme 1. The next 3 are dealing with theme 2. The next 4 deal with theme 3. The next 4 deal with theme 4. 114 deals with theme 5. The first 3 verses of chapter 2 deal with theme number 6. And then we go back to theme 1 when we hit verse 4 of chapter 2. And we cycle through these 6 themes again throughout chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3. You get to 3:7. We go back to theme 1 again. And this pattern keeps going in rotation exactly like this. Now, what is this pattern all about? Well, another thing that's interesting about this pattern is that it very much fits the content of the book of Hebrews. Because the content of the book of Hebrews is an attempt to explain why faith with the Son of God is greater than faith without the Son of God. It attempts to explain why he's important. It explains why he is greater than the prophets, why he is greater than our forefathers, why he is greater than the angels, why he is the most important aspect of our faith. And it warns Jewish believers in the Messiah not to go back to a form of Judaism that does not include the Son, the Messiah, as part of that faith, because he is greater than faith without him. These themes help to accentuate that concept, because really these themes are all about, you can really call them the greater than pattern in a sense, because they all start with a few root letters and built upon that. Just to show you what I mean by that, let's take a look at the first example. Theme 1 is what I'm going to call Al Yaday Plus. And theme 1 can deal with several different possible concepts, but they're all built from Al Yaday. In other words, if we take the Hebrew letters Ayin, Lamed, Yud, Dalet, Yud, we can actually split this up into 2 words, and there's 2 different ways we can split this up into 2 words. If we put a split between the Lamed and the Yud, then we've got 2 words that mean Al Yaday. And that literally, in Hebrew, that literally means through the hands of. And figuratively, that can mean more than one thing. It might refer to agency, that is, one person doing things through the hands of another. So you've got a principal, you've got an agent carrying out what he wants to do. And that's one of the concepts that could be conveyed by through the hands of. We don't talk that way in English. In English, we would just say through. But in Hebrew, they typically say through the hands of. So they get a little more graphic with how they describe this. Through the hands of can also refer to power. In other words, it can talk about power. It can also mean by someone's side. In other words, Al Yaday, Al can also mean near or at. And so when you say at hand, this is kind of like the phrase at hand in English. It can refer to nearness. We can also split this up. If we put a break between the first Yud and the Dalet, then we get Ali Dai, which would mean something different. because that phrase would mean upon me is enough, or upon me is sufficiency, or I have enough. It essentially is conveying the thought, I have everything that I need. So we can actually take this word, split it up two different ways, and get two different messages out of it. Sometimes when we're on theme 1, we're dealing with the concept of through the hands of, and sometimes we're dealing with the concept of sufficiency. So sometimes we get one concept, sometimes we get another, but keep in mind that both of these concepts can be spelled in Hebrew using identically the same letters. And that is one of the reasons why this pattern is very much Hebrew-based pattern and not a Greek pattern, not an English pattern, not an Aramaic pattern. No. This is very much Hebrew-based thought. And we can see the fact that it's Hebrew-based thought because when we're on theme 1, we're sometimes on one concept, sometimes on another, but these concepts are linked together in Hebrew thought, and they're not linked together in any other language. So that's one of the things that puts the stamp of Hebrewness on this pattern. We can also add 2 letters to the end of this phrase. If we add an ayin and a hey, we get a phrase that says concerning knowledge. And sometimes when we're on theme 1, we're actually dealing with the concept of knowledge. So, again, that's 3 ideas that are linked together in Hebrew thought, but not in any other language. Theme 2 is all about being greater than. One thing being greater than another. And as I said before, that fits the whole content of this pattern and the whole content of this letter, because it's all about the Son being greater than the angels, the prophets, and the forefathers. And so the pattern that runs throughout this letter deals with that concept of being greater than. Theme 2 is all about one thing being greater than another, but in each of these cases, we've got themes where sometimes you have concepts that are greater in length than their root concept. In other words, with Al Yaday here, with the first theme, I said that one of the concepts connected with theme 1 is concerning knowledge. We get that by adding 2 letters to the end of Al Yaday, and then we've got a whole different word. And when we add those letters, of course, we've got a concept that is spelled with a greater number of letters than the root concept that was involved. Theme 3 is what I'm going to call Dor plus. Dor means generation in Hebrew. And theme 2 deals with either the concept of generation, or it can also deal with several other things. You might want to call this Dor Lador, or in other words, generation to generation, because it often deals with how things pass from one generation to another. Sometimes we get a new concept by adding a letter to it. Keep in mind, and this happens with nearly all of the themes here, if we add a hey to the beginning, we get the word for glory, and sometimes glory is what's connected with theme 3. And if we add a noon to the end, we get a word in Hebrew that means gift, and sometimes a gift or an inheritance is what is connected with theme 3. Theme 4 is what I like to call Tsar plus. Now, most of the time, this theme is not Tsar, which can mean either narrow or enemy, but it's usually a concept that is derived by taking Tsar and adding another letter to it. For example, Yatzar means form, and that is a concept that is frequently found connected with the 4th theme, and we get that by adding a Yud to Tsar. Flip the letters around, you've got Ratzi, you got Resh Tzadi Yud, which means my will, and the concept of will is often connected with theme 4. Tzadi Resh Yud Kuf Kaf means need or must. Tzrik means need or must, and that's another word that it can be built from Tsar. So there are several concepts that are spelled in Hebrew that can be built from the root letters for Tsar, and each of these are frequently connected with theme 4 and connected together only in Hebrew thought. Theme 5 is what I call Melech plus, because it deals with concepts that are built from the letters Mem, Lamed, Kaf. Now, that could be words such as king, kingdom, angel, messenger, or work. Sometimes it's a slightly different permutation of these letters, because sometimes instead of mem kaf, it might be mem kaf lamed instead of mem lamed kaf. And some of the words we could get from that would either be food or decay. This is one of the few, I think the only theme in this pattern that actually has an Aramaic word to it. We can build an Aramaic word for assurance with these letters. Theme 6 is what I like to call Shav plus, and it deals with concepts that can be built from the letters Shin and Vav as the root. And among them are Yeshav. If we add a Yud to the beginning of this, we've got Yeshav, which can either mean to sit or to dwell. Expressed another way, it can also mean he will return, and it's the root for the word teshuva, which means repentance. Add a nun to the end, and you got the Hebrew word for posterior, or in other words, one thing following another, and quite often that is a concept that is connected with theme 6. Other words we can make out of this are shuv, which means again, or if we add an ayin to the end, we've got the Hebrew word for swear or oath. Add a hey to the end, you've got the Hebrew word for captive, and shaviv, which means spark or flame, is another word that is frequently associated with theme 6. All of these concepts are sometimes present when we're on theme 6. Maybe not all of them all of the time, typically a subset of them at each time. But they're all connected in Hebrew thought, but not in Greek thought and not in any other language. Now, the book of Hebrews cycles between these themes. It can morph from one to the other. And sometimes there's some overlap between these themes. And one of the things I want to point out is that this pattern can be seen in both the Greek and in the Hebrew text. However, there is an important distinction, because I can pull out the Greek text, or I can even use a translation from a Greek text. I could use an English text, an English translation of the Greek text, and I can show you this pattern. However, I can show you how it cycles through these 6 themes. However, every once in a while there's an exception, because every once in a while in the Greek text we find that there's a hole in the pattern. In other words, we see this pattern enough that we will come to expect the pattern. I could show you this pattern showing up so frequently that you're going to expect the pattern to just keep it on, and you're going to expect to see the next theme in the pattern simply because it appears so many times where it's supposed to. But in the Greek text there are a few holes in the pattern, whereas in the Hebrew text there isn't. We don't have that problem in the Hebrew text. And that's one of the things that I believe definitely helps to establish the originality to the Hebrew text. Because, stop and think about this for a moment, if the Hebrew text is not the original to the Greek, then that means that someone not only took a Greek text and translated it into Hebrew, but they restored missing elements of this pattern without knowing that the pattern was there. Now, how likely is that? Pretty much impossible, I would say. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's nearly impossible to draw any other objective conclusion other than the fact that the Hebrew version of Hebrews is indeed the original that the Greek was translated from. Now, as I said before, the book of Hebrews cycles through these themes at kind of the paragraph level that you are seeing being shown on your screen right now. And I guess you can't see this if you're listening to this on the radio, but if you're watching this on the video, then you can see how it's cycling through these themes at the paragraph level. But when we drill down to a specific paragraph, we also see that there are individual words, individual concepts present in that paragraph that run through this pattern, both forward and reverse at the same time in most cases. Let me show you an example of that by just simply going through. Let's go through the first paragraph, and I will show you what I mean by that. The first 3 verses of the book of Hebrews, and I'm going to read out of my English translation of the Hebrew text. So this is going to be a little bit different than if you're trying to follow along in a Greek translation from the Greek. But it says, in the days of old, Adonai spoke unto the fathers in many times and in many ways through the hands of the prophets. It came to pass in the end of days, he spoke to us through the hands of his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and in whom he created all the worlds. For he is the brightness of his glory, and in fashioning or forming, he is a worker of all things, in the power of his... Now, the next Hebrew word here can either be demise or wounds. They both make sense, because we understand that it wasn't that, well, okay, you could say his wounds were his demise, you could say his wounds killed him, but he conquered death. So in reality, those wounds were not his demise in the long term, by any stretch of the imagination. They were an empowerment for the risen Messiah. And from whom that which poured forth through his hands causes liberation of our sins. Behold, he sits in high places at the right hand of the Shekinah. Now, in the Hebrew text, it says Shekinah means presence, and that's what it actually says in the Hebrew text. In the Greek text, it says Father. Most people mispronounce this word Shekinah, and most people have the misimpression that Shekinah means glory. It does not mean glory. It's properly pronounced Shekinah, and it actually means presence, not glory. Now, his presence is a very glorious thing, but it does not mean glory. Okay. Now, we see the concept of Al Yadeh all through this paragraph. Okay. And we can see all of the various meanings of Al Yadeh in here. Because it talks about the Father working through the hands of his Son. That is, in Hebrew, is the phrase Al Yadeh. Usually we would just say through in English, but it talks about power, which is one of the concepts that's associated with Al Yadeh. And it talks about nearness, which is another of the concepts associated with Al Yadeh in Hebrew. So we get all of the different meanings of Al Yadeh in here somewhere. And we see that there's a lot of eloquent use and reuse of the same phrase here in the Hebrew text. And of course, Jerome told us that the original Hebrew version was very eloquent. And if you're reading this in Hebrew, if you can read Hebrew, and you're actually reading this in the Hebrew, this is a very powerful paragraph. It, pretty much was like somebody slapped me in the face when I read this for the first time. It almost knocked me out of my chair. I mean, it was a very powerful passage. And it kind of loses something in translation, because if you don't really understand how these things are worded in Hebrew, then, I can explain this to you in English, but something does kind of get lost in the translation of it all. And I can only do so much about trying to restore your understanding of that. But it is a very eloquently worded passage when you read this in the original Hebrew. But not only is Al Yadeh all through this paragraph, and it not only does it appear in different places, and it's a running theme that's used and reused. Different shades of meaning to that phrase are used in different ways in this passage. But we see the entire pattern being run through both forward and reverse in this passage at a more of a word level or thought level, at a subparagraph level, at kind of the sentence and or phrase level. And just to show you what I mean by that, the word through here, well, we certainly see the first theme being discussed. We see it all over the place, so that's not hard to find. The concept of one thing being greater than another, the Son being greater than the prophets, is also discussed. We see the concept of door plus. Remember, one of the things I said was connected with door was that we see it present in calling the Messiah the Son, because that's one generation passing to another. But also, when it says that he is an heir, that he is the heir, well, that's another concept connected with theme 3, because Doran, which means gift, is also connected with theme 3. And then it talks about him forming the world. So it uses Yitzar, which is a word from theme 4. It says that he is the worker. There's Melech plus, because Melechah can be built from the root letters to theme 5. And we see theme 6. We see dwelling, present, which is one of the concepts associated with theme 6, when it says that he sits in high places at the right hand of the Father. So there's the pattern going forward in the forward direction all through this paragraph. We also see this pattern going backwards. The very first sentence, when he says, in the days of old, Adonai spoke to our fathers many times in many ways through the hands of the prophets. Okay, the concept of listening, which would come from yeshiva, which can mean school, and connected with learning. We see the concept of learning being present in this first sentence. And then it says, it came to pass in the end of days. So there's one thing following another. There's one time period that follows another. And that gives us another Hebrew word that is built from this, which, of course, that is the Hebrew word yashvan. We could see melech plus in the concept of the worlds, because one of the things that can be built from melech is malkut, which is kingdom. Can be thought of as using the same thing for theme 4. Theme 3 can be seen because it talks about the Son's involvement in pouring the gift of salvation. And, of course, that fits theme 3, which can involve the ran, which is a gift. And we see we see the second theme of one thing being greater than another present when it says that he sits in high places, because high places are greater than low places if we measure them in terms of height. And it says he sits at the right hand of the Father. So there is the concept of Al Yadeh present once again at the end of this phrase. So we see Al Yadeh happening all through this paragraph, but we also see the pattern being traversed in both a forward direction and in a reverse direction all through this paragraph. We see individual keywords in the forward direction very easily. Sometimes you have to think about this more at the thought level. It's actually what I would call not quite a sentence, but a partial sentence at more of a thought level when you go in reverse. Sometimes it's an individual keyword, but sometimes it's kind of a part of a sentence, an entire sentence that we can see the thought process in. Okay, let's go on to the next set of 3 verses. And keep in mind that usually these paragraphs are typically 3 or 4 verses long, sometimes more, sometimes less. But the next 3 verses are verses 4 through 6, which discuss the next theme, or which is the theme of one thing being greater than another. And in this passage, he introduces why the Son is greater than the angels and those who came before him. He says in this paragraph, and as he obtained a name more glorious and stronger than the angels, so is he by his might esteemed of greater importance, and he shall be glorified more than them. To which of the angels has he spoken in this form? You are in the form of my Son, today I have begotten you. And again in another place, I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. And again, another agrees. When he brought forth his firstborn son into the world, he said, and let all the angels of Elohim, let all the angels of God worship him, or more literally, bow down to him, since the phrase here that's used in the Hebrew text being quoted from literally means bow down, but it implies worship. So when we use that phrase, we're talking about bowing, but we're bowing because we're paying honor and worshiping the person we're bowing down to. All through here, we see the concept of greater than being discussed. That's hard to miss, okay? Because that's the whole point to everything being discussed in this paragraph. But we also see at least one of the concepts connected with each of the 6 themes present in both a forward and reverse pattern in this paragraph. And I'm going to show you that here. Now, the Al Yadeh, the first theme, is actually present really. We find it at the end of the previous paragraph. So, without breaking the pattern, We could say that this starts with the concept of greater than, which is all the way through here, but you see it right smack at the beginning because he talks about his name being greater than any names that the angels have been given. We see glory being discussed, which is one of the themes, one of the concepts connected with theme 3, which I explained earlier. We see him talk about form twice here. Okay, he said he spoke in this form, so there's theme 4 being used. He talks about angels, of course, is built from Melech plus theme 5. It contains the root letters from which you would spell the word angel, so the fact that we're talking about angels here can fulfill theme 5. And bowing down is a fulfillment of theme 6, because again, Yeshua, when we talk, one of the reasons there is a connection between the concept of dwelling and sitting and learning, of course, is because you learn at the master's feet here. And when you bow down, you're actually lowering yourself to their feet. And so this is kind of a way of recognizing that person as being the master in Hebrew thought here. So we see all these these themes here being traversed in the forward direction. We also see them happening in the reverse direction. We see Shav, we saw that at the end of the first verse. And then we see angels being discussed right away. So we see that can be considered fulfillment of the reverse direction of the pattern. When he talks, again, he says, I already explained 2 cases the word form being in here. He talks about the sun as the sun, which of course is a fulfillment of dor, which means generation. And we've got the concept of greater than being fulfilled in here. So there's theme 2. Of course, that's all through here. And then the concept of sufficiency is in here, which again would be alidai. That's one of the concepts associated with theme 1. And we see the concept of sufficiency in here because he quotes 2 verses in order to establish a fact. Right? Remember, we need, according to Torah, 2 or 3 witnesses to establish a matter. He quotes 2 verses. That is sufficient to establish a matter. So that's how we see the concept of sufficiency being present in this verse. Let's go through one more. In verses 7 through 10, he says, but to the angels, he said, he makes his angels spirits, ministers of a flaming fire. But to the Son, he said, behold, Elohim, your throne forever and ever, a scepter of justice is the scepter of your kingdom. You love righteousness and hated iniquity. Because this is so, God, or Elohim, your Elohim, has anointed you with the oil of gladness more than your companions, and you, Adonai, from before. So here we see all of the 6 themes being run through both in forward and reverse direction. Again, the first theme is the previous paragraph ends on the first theme. The second theme opens up this one because we're definitely seeing the concept of greater than present in the logical contrast between what was said to the angels and what was said to the Son. And he's trying to point out to the fact that something greater was said to the Son that was ever said to the angels. We see the 4th theme present in the concept of form or substance because it talks about the angels being, what their substance is, how they're spirits, and how they're ministers of flaming fire. So it's talking about their substance here. We see the concept of kingdom present. That's Malkut, which is one of the things that can be built from Melech plus, which is theme 5. And we see Shav plus, the 6th theme present, because Yashvan is present when he says, and you, Adonai, from before. Because that's discussing one thing leading into another. One thing following another. We see this pattern in reverse as we go through here, because again, theme 6 was at the end of the previous verse. But we see angels being spoke of immediately at the beginning of this. That's theme 5. We see theme 4 present in the spirits and in the flaming fire. You can pick which of those two you want to count for the forward direction, which one you want to count for the reverse. But, again, they're both in there. Door plus, we see in the concept of forever, because generation to generation, that can imply a sense of foreverness to it. We see the concept of one thing being greater than another, being present, of course, all through here, but he also says here at the end, he has anointed you with the oil of gladness more than your companions. Okay, so we see the concept of more than present here near the end of this paragraph. And when he says your companions, what are your companions? Those are people who are at your side. So there's Al-Yaday again, which is theme 1. Now, let me say this. This stuff is stuff that's not necessarily that easy to see. I mean, you got to be looking for this. Okay? You almost have to already know the patterns there. I saw this because God showed me the pattern. He showed me that the pattern existed, and then I started looking for the details. So this is the kind of thing that it's complex from several standpoints. It's complex due to the fact that it's moving fast and therefore hard to catch everything when you start getting down to the subparagraph level. At the paragraph level, this isn't as hard to see. Okay, in fact, when God first showed me this, He first showed it to me at the paragraph level, and then I started seeing it at deeper levels. But it's a complex pattern because it's multi-layer, and everything's tied together in Hebrew thought. You're not going to see this unless you can think in Hebrew. I mean, you've got to be able to think in Hebrew to be able to see this pattern. And one of the reasons you got to be able to think in Hebrew to see this pattern is because you're not going to connect the various concepts that are part of the same themes without being able to think about this in Hebrew. You know, you've got to be able to find the root and then find the other concepts that are built from that root, because there's a root theme and then concepts built from that root theme. And those individual concepts are greater in length in terms of the number of characters that spell them than the root theme that the pattern is based on. But it's all there, and it's a very fascinating pattern. Now, one of the things that makes this pattern so fascinating is because there are places where there are holes in the Greek. And let me point out, I'm going to kind of skip forward. And there's a number of places where this happens. Now, there are a number of places where there is a hole in the Greek. But what I want to do is to focus on one where it's understandable why the hole exists. To explain that, let me just grab an example here. It says in Hebrews 10:35 through 37, "Do not cast away your faith following your nation, for we have a great recompense," or a great reward. "But you must be like this, bearing patience, through which you do the will of God to receive the assurance." Now, I want you to capture something in your mind. This letter is all about, it's written to Jewish believers in the Messiah, saying, don't be like Jewish unbelievers who don't accept the Messiah. Okay, that's what the letter was about. And so when he says, don't cast away your faith following your nation, well, the phrase, your nation, following your nation, is a very Jewish phrase here. And I guess when they translated this into Greek, they felt like people wouldn't be able to make sense out of this. In other words, if you were a Christian and you lived in a city where the king of that city was a Christian, and he made Christianity the religion of that city, then this phrase might not make a lot of sense to a reader like that. What do you mean, following my nation? My nation is a Christian nation. So to a Gentile audience, to a Gentile Christian audience, this might not have made any sense. And when they translated it into Greek, of course, they were translating it so that a Greek audience could understand the letter. And this would have just simply complicated the interpretation of the letter. So what they did was they decided to just simply not translate those words. so as to not create confusion. So we can understand why they left those words out in the Greek text. That makes sense. Okay, it's not that they were trying to it's not that they mistranslated or made a mistake. It's just that the translator felt like a Greek audience would be better off to not have that in their version of the text because it might not make sense to certain Greek audiences. It might make sense to some Greek audiences, but it might not make sense to other Greek audiences. So they just simply left it out. But we need it in order to fulfill the pattern. Because in order to see the reverse pattern in here, well, we need the Yashvan aspect of Shav plus because the word we see it in the word following, but that's missing from the Greek. Okay, we also see the Malkut of Melech plus in your nation because Malkut means kingdom. That's connected with theme 5, which is Melech plus. So we cannot see the reverse pattern. The first two themes of the reverse pattern, or the last two themes of the pattern, the first two of the reverse pattern, are missing from this passage in the Greek text, but they're present in the Hebrew. Now, we understand why they dropped this. Okay, that makes sense. So, it's not like this is a mistake in the Greek text or anything, but it does demonstrate that it does demonstrate that the Hebrew version is the original version. Because if the Greek version was written first, and somebody added this to the Hebrew, how did they know that this is where we're at on the theme? How did they notice this? How did they restore something that fits with the theme? Well, I think the only real good explanation for this is the fact that this thing was originally written in Hebrew. It's a whole lot easier to accept the idea that this was originally written in Hebrew and then translated into Greek, and that's why the pattern's here, than to accept the idea that it was translated from Greek to Hebrew, and somehow, some way, they just magically added a couple of words that magically fit the pattern. Well, that's silly. I mean, that's too much of a coincidence to be a coincidence. It can't possibly be the proper explanation for things. And I think the only safe conclusion is that this is a very good example of there being a hole in the Greek text that points to the originality of the Hebrew. Now, this is just one example. It's not the only example. There are other examples in the book of Hebrews like this. I picked this one because it's a double hole. I mean, you've got two themes missing here. And I also picked it because it's really easy to understand why this was left out of the Greek text. But there's other places where text was left out of the Greek text where they didn't translate a word or a phrase kind of like this, and there is a theme missing from the text. Now, even in the Greek text, you see this theme, you see these 6 themes often enough that you're going to come to expect them. And you're going to wonder why it's missing right here. I mean, you'd look at this and say, why is it missing from the Greek? But the explanation is really found in the fact that the Hebrew text is the original. So, there's more on this. I'm not going to go through all this. I can't possibly cover all this in a reasonable amount of time for a brief lecture. However, I do have many pages devoted to this in my book, The Hebrew Pages of the New Testament. And in the Hebrew pages of the New Testament, I actually go through every verse that's in the book of Hebrews, and I demonstrate how every verse that's in there fits the pattern laid down by these 6 themes that I have described to you. And overall, this is a very lengthy chapter, in fact, because in order to go through every verse and show you how every passage in here relates to the themes at both the paragraph level and the forward and reverse level, it takes a while to get through all this. But it's a fascinating study. I'll also say this, you might be able to find more to this pattern, because in the book, I tried to keep it reasonably simple. In the book, I discuss the paragraph level aspect to the pattern. I also discuss the forward and reverse patterns within each paragraph. This pattern, I think, exists also at a higher level than the paragraph level, and that there's actually chapters and some of those chapters may even be grouped together. So I think this actually exists at an even higher level than what I covered in the book. But I'll let you read this, study this, and see what you can do to take this to a deeper level. Now, this teaching is at the end of my book. It's one of the ending chapters, not quite the last chapter, I think next to last chapter or so of my book, The Hebrew Pages of the New Testament, where I supply the entire Hebrew text of Hebrews as well as an English translation and compare it side by side with the Greek text and an English translation of it. I think that you're going to find that studying this Hebrew text of Hebrews is one of the most fascinating, eye-opening experiences you're going to have. And I also just want to say that that's about all that I have on this topic, at least for now. I've got a lot more on this topic in my book, of course, but for now, I'm going to leave it at that because I think I have explained enough of this in order to convey the general ideal. To really dig in the details, you're going to need to just read the book. But I just want to thank you for listening, and may God bless your study of this topic even more in the future. Shalom. Click below to subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to visit my website at www.messiahalive.net. That's www.messiahalive.net.